The desire to find the metaphysical truth about the nature of reality and existence is not about actual metaphysical true nature of existence. It is about psychological wholeness. And every philosopher just wants to be psychologically whole, but then projects this desire for internal psychological wholeness to some external metaphysics that are always completely inaccessible. That's why there has never been a true philosophical ultimate theory of everything. And you might argue that Plato and Aristotle, even back then, understood so much about what we understand now. And all we have done is rephrased things and changed how we understand the meaning behind these words. Not that philosophy hasn't evolved at all, and there hasn't been legitimately a lot of nuance created through this mental landscape. But I'd argue that most people, me included in the past, that are interested in philosophy really are interested in spirituality, but don't have the language or the framework or the environment to fuel this. Because metaphysics, what is metaphysics? Can anybody show an example of a metaphysical experiment? Like when we talk about other dimensions or the nature of consciousness or the ultimate nature of reality, the moment we can prove it and understand how it really functions, it becomes just part of normal physics. So metaphysics is almost like the scientifically more accepted way to talk about spirituality. Or I would stand by that. Metaphysics doesn't really exist. It's just kind of like a spiritual belief in something beyond. And the tricky thing here is that, of course, there exists something beyond our biological bodies. And there also exists something beyond our biological minds. Like if we die, then existence still happens. And maybe there are things beyond this universe and beyond this dimension. But I would just call it physics. It's pretty much just how the law of the universe or whatever lies beyond this universe work. The meta aspect of it comes mostly from existential seeking. It's trying to find the truth that gives your life purpose, gives your life meaning, and gives self-understanding. And the self-understanding is actually found in psychology. But psychology, at least here in the West, lacks all the spiritual components that are extremely important to be whole from within. Because the spiritual aspect is about the investigative nature about your internal experience. You might say that science is the investigation of the external world, and spirituality is about the investigation of the internal world. And the investigation of the internal world will inevitably lead you to spirituality. Because it is not possible to not come sooner or later, if you're sincerely investigating the nature of the self, come into contact with the ego. And when you come into contact with the ego and you start to deconstruct what the ego is, your entire sense of objective reality starts to fall apart. And depending on who you are, there are like different layers to this. It might just at the beginning feel all just philosophical, like, oh, I noticed that reality is actually deterministic. My idea of free will wasn't real, and everything just works with atom and scientific laws. Now, this is one layer. On the deeper layer, you might notice, oh, okay, so the idea of free will was an idea made up by the ego to give the ego an illusion of control. So this doesn't exist. Then you can go another layer deeper and notice, oh, okay, so I can actually dissolve the sense of ego, not just believe that free will is an illusion, but dissolve the sense of free will that dissolves my sense of control or doership in my own reality. And from there, so many branches spawn where people start to experience stuff that there are no other words to describe it, but this is a spiritual experience or a transcendent experience, or if you so will, a metaphysical experience. If you're going through these experiences right now and you don't really have an objective container for these, then check out my Ego Architecture Audit in the description below. If you experience philosophy as some sort of investigative nature about truth, you are actually looking for the nature of the self, which is the true nature of all of experience, but it is clouded and overshadowed by the delusions of the ego. And the delusions of the ego include philosophy, because philosophy is part of what the ego constructs to build a reality model to stay in that reality model. But if you truly dissolve completely, then there are no reality models anymore. You dissolve into the immediacy of experience that has no framework to contain it. And this, again, is not a philosophy that I'm saying to you. It is a process that you can move through, and it's an experience that changes your perception of reality and makes you realize the actual truth, which is the metaphysical truth that everybody who is into metaphysics or philosophy is actually looking for. Now, to accept this is not easy because there's so much identity built around wanting to know what's true and knowing what is true. And even the idea that I just said, like, oh, reality is actually deterministic. Well, okay, if reality is actually deterministic, isn't not sort of like a philosophical belief? Like, how do you know this is actually the case? But even then, I can move another layer deeper and say the idea of determinism itself as some sort of thing you can perceive in your day-to-day experience is also still part of an illusion that overlays some sort of deterministic framework in existence, which is still some sort of projection of the mind that is ultimately also not real. And there, if you disintegrate this, you might say, yeah, I'm just completely free. I'm a human that does human things, and I can be aware about what I do and then, decide on what I do there. So this is just one example of, how you move through philosophy, through these different perceptions of reality and existence. And each of those has like different layers of truth to it, different layers of experience or intensity, and also different layers of suffering. For me, it was very relieving to realize determinism is real. And I suspect for a lot of atheists, this is also the case. That's why there's also like a correlation between people who are believing in God and believe in free will, and atheists who believe in determinism. And a lot of what determinism does is it relieves you of a lot of guilt and this anxiety to try to control reality. And here you can enter like a stoic frame where everything happens on its own and it's all moving in its own way, which is very relieving. And it's true. But there is this entire dynamic in which there's still an ego there that pretends it can control reality, even if you believe determinism is true. And then by believing determinism is true, you feel like reality just acts on its own, and the ego doesn't have to be investigated anymore because everything happens automatically anyway. And then you can pretend that whenever you have an emotional outburst, you behave with ill will, like treating other people unfairly, or something bad happens to you, that you had no influence in the matter or no control in the matter, when what you actually were lacking, where your real free will lies, is in the awareness of your own ego. And through that, you discover more and more of what metaphysics really is. Because you do, in fact, have some extremely transcendental experiences through this process that there are no other words to describe it than, this is some metaphysical truth. I would argue, though, that if you really want to understand reality, then we should just apply physics to whatever we experience as metaphysical. And I would say that all these ego dynamics, all the sense of enlightenment, all of the sense of transcendence or life after death, all of this is likely be able to be mathed out. And I suspect that math as a language, maybe it's not universally applicable, but I suspect it is. And consciousness and ego and death and transcendence and holiness and shame and all of this, you can boil it down to some sort of math. And this again moves away from maybe the spiritual narrative that some people who are into metaphysics or into spirituality in this case don't like. And so I also like to take this very extreme spiritual version of transcendence and then boil it down to raw mechanics and machinery, which I do think is the case. There's an awakening type that is the head awakening, which is the intellectual aspect of it, which basically relates to the ability to realize in a permanent way, not just as like a glimpse, but like in a permanent way, that all words are not true, or also multiple truths exist at the same time. This means that you do not need to fall into one belief system or into another belief system or into one framework or another framework, because all frameworks have their validity depending on the context. Because reality is not like it is ultimately one, but it is not one thing alone. Like there exist multiple people on this planet at the same time, and it's not a contradiction or a paradox. They're just different, points in space. And even though they might be all united as some sort of cosmic experience or just cosmic unity in the fact that they do exist at all, but it doesn't mean that there are not actually differences, like that there are dualities within the whole. And from this duality, you can experience that there is in fact truth out there. But the truth that is out there is way more obvious and immediate and in your face than some sort of abstraction or philosophical abstraction that the mind causes. Because you are already in contact with metaphysical truth. It's just that metaphysical truth and physical truth and psychological truth and philosophical truth are all one and the same, and social truth for that matter. They all exist within this construct and this modality of perception. And the layer of delusion is to the extent to which your ego is deluded from its own self-narratives. And how aware are you and how conscious are you to perceive your actual sensory experience? Because a lot of what we do is we suppress our emotions. We suppress our past. We suppress our worries about the future. We suppress so much energy, and the suppression becomes energy that kind of tortures us from the inside. And since we don't know what to do with this energy, then we make up a philosophy. Oh, I am a cynic, and existence is actually quite bad and evil. I'm a misanthrope, and all humanity is pretty much born out of evil, and humans shouldn't exist. And it's a response or like a coping mechanism to whatever you have going on in your psychology. And you can notice that almost all foundational philosophical beliefs that anybody carries is some sort of coping mechanism. Now, this is a huge hit to the ego because it was convinced that what it believes philosophically is merit from years of intellectualization and years of thinking about these very deep topics. But the sense of depth in of itself, the sense like, oh my God, I'm so deep, I'm realizing so much about the nature of reality. The sense of depth is what the ego is in part. Now, there are true depths of experiences, but this feeling of spirituality or the sense of depth is usually an aspect of some sort of dissolution process on one hand, or also ego aggrandizement on the other. And spirituality, since it's about the investigative nature of the self, or about you, whenever you experience a dissolution of this, you have this qualia of spirituality. Whenever the ego transforms or shifts, now suddenly things become very, very spiritual. That's why atheists tend to be very solid in their identity or in their ego structure, and they don't really shift much because they have constructed something that works, and then it's solid and it feels okay. Depending on how, if you want to imagine it like geometrically, imagine the ego is like a shape. Depending on how smooth the edges are in that shape, the more you feel like solid or comfortable in your identity, and the more rigid the edges are, or the more corners you have that aren't like smoothed out, the more you will be neurotic or clash because you're actually not, you're not solid in your identity, and you might feel very awkward, very uncertain, depending on which situation. I'm, of course, very, very much simplifying here because I don't actually have a 3D model of the ego. But that's what I'm doing in the architecture audit when I talk to people directly. It's just not a 3D model, but a model made out of language. Because you can really, through expertise and having seen the patterns time and time again, know how the ego in a particular individual functions. And on a lot of surface level, humans do this all the time, right? We do understand, okay, this guy is being very arrogant, or this guy is being very narcissistic, or this guy is being just rude because he cannot stand to be criticized. But in actuality, a lot of this also can be projection from your own ego. So it's not that easy, and that's why there are people who have more awareness of how the ego functions than others, and this is where the spiritual ego comes in place, right? Like, I have more awareness of my ego than you, and there are people play these silly games. But if you are truly understanding, or not just understanding, but dissolving of your sense of self, then these games don't really matter anymore, and they have no point because you're not fueling anything. Once the ego is seen sufficiently as an illusion, it becomes absolutely pointless to argue about who is right and who is wrong and who has more awareness than the other, because all that matters is just the awareness that is lying underneath.